everyone. My name is Rosemary Bernabe. I'm Associate Professor of Medical Research Ethics in the University of Southeastern Norway and a researcher of medical ethics in the University of Oslo. So in this lecture, we will talk about the basic procedures of research ethics committees. We will look into how research ethics committees work, but also the principles behind the procedures that research ethics committees follow.
Today, we will be talking about research ethics committees at work. Specifically, we will talk about what research ethics committees do in terms of procedures, but also in terms of evaluation. But before we start looking into all of these little details, we probably should begin with the mandate of research ethics committees. Yeah? So the purpose of an ethics committee or a research ethics committee in reviewing biomedical research, or any kind of research for that matter, is to contribute to safeguarding the dignity, rights, safety, and well-being of all actual or potential research participants. And so we have to remember that. Now, so research ethics committees are there not to provide some kind of legal assurance, that the researcher will not have any kind of legal troubles. Right? That comes in secondary. Right? It's also not there so that researchers will be able to publish their research. Again, that is also secondary. The basic purpose of research ethics committees is to protect the safety and the well-being of research participants. Okay, so a cardinal principle of research involving human participants is to respect respect for the dignity of persons. The goals of research, while important, should never be permitted to override the health, well-being, and care of research participants. Right. So, and this is the primacy principle. So it means that the reason why there are research ethics committees because the dignity of persons should come in as of primary importance, right? So no matter how important a research is, this dignity of the human person who will be shall we say, research participants cannot be waived, right? And therefore that needs to be safeguarded. Yeah. Justice requires that the benefits and burdens of research be distributed fairly among all groups and classes in society, taking into account age, gender, economic status, culture, and ethnic considerations. Right. So part of the mandate of research ethics committees in terms of safeguarding the rights, safety, and well-being of research participants is to ensure that there's justice in research. Right. There's justice in the planning of research, in the actual doing of research, and post-research, right? In the planning stage, it means who do you include or who do you exclude in the research process, right? Were participants included out of convenience, or was it the product of a thorough evaluation of who should really be included in it? Because scientifically that will bring out the best results, but also because these participants and their communities stand to benefit, right? And after research is done, what kind of benefits would the community and the participants receive, if any? So there are several justice issues, and to a certain extent, research ethics committees are also mandated to ensure that a minimum level of justice is present, a minimal acceptable and ethical level of justice is present in research. All right. With that in mind, we can look into what are the ethical challenges that are developed in developing countries. But I would be quick to say that these ethical challenges are not only challenges in low and middle income countries. These ethical challenges are also routinely encountered in high income countries for many reasons. Number one of which would be lack of resources and lack of time, right? So let's just go through them very quickly. One is qualification, training, and support of research personnel, including the principal investigator, but also the qualification, training, and support of individuals who will be part of the Research Ethics Committee, right? Second is ensuring independent review. And also, like we had one study wherein we saw that in some instances there were research ethics committees where the principal investigator was also a member of the evaluating ethics committee, and that is an obvious conflict of interest. But because in low and middle income countries, we cannot avoid the fact that there might be limited resources in terms of specialists, right? So it could happen that the principal investigator was also or is also included in the ethics committee. So by the way, that is unethical practice, and that should never happen. And if that happens, that should always be addressed, right? Another ethical challenge will be the practice of continuing review or post-approval responsibilities. So ideally, research ethics committees, as we said a while ago, should be looking into the welfare of research participants, not only before the study begins, but also during the study, and ideally also after the study. So ideally, ethics committees should have some sort of a responsibility, should have some sort of an oversight on a study while it is happening, and ideally just immediately after it has ended. But as I've said a while ago, because of resources, because research ethics committees are overworked or overburdened with limited number of people and so many clinical trials, this responsibility of a continuing review or post approval responsibilities may be very difficult to do. Okay? By continuing review, it simply means review of amendments, progress, looking into final reports, protocol deviations, ideally also knowing what's happening in the site by ideally, for example, visiting these sites, etc., etc. So it is quite easy for an ethics committee to receive these reports, but looking into these reports and evaluating them, visiting a site is another matter. That's why it is an ethical challenge. And then another ethical challenge will be the adaptation of an ethics committee in low and middle income country to international norms, simply because this international norms require many things, which means putting in resources, right? So there will be, of course, the formal requirements, which may or may not be difficult to do, such as making sure that there's quorum. That's probably easy. Making sure that the minutes of the evaluation is available, that there's adequate documentation, that they have, shall we say, facilities, to keep these documents in a locked and safe place, etc., etc. While material adaptations mean making sure that ethics committees follow the norms and guidelines that are in place internationally. So this means, for example, that ethics committee members are properly trained, right, and are very much familiar with these international norms. Okay. Now we saw this in an earlier session when we talked about principles of research ethics. So research ethics committees are there to ensure that these ethical principles are in place, right? So, and as we said, it is during the design of the study and the actual study and post-trial post-trial or post-study. Right. So what we will look at now will be the actual procedures that should be in place to make sure that ethics committees look into these principles. But first, let's address some of these formal requirements. So when a researcher or research performing organization submits an application for an ethics review, of course, there will always be an application form, and an application form would contain something like this. This is an example from Norway. So if a researcher will apply for ethics review, the application form contains or requires this information. So introduction, who are the researchers? What's this research? General information, project information and method, study population and consent, rights and protection of personal data, balanced justification of risks and benefits, insurance, interest and publication, and declaration of responsibility. At the same time, with the application form would be usually the requirement to insert attachments, one of which would be the protocol. According to ICH GCP, the protocol should contain the following: general information, background information, trial objectives and purpose, trial design, selection and withdrawal of subjects, treatment of subjects, assessment of efficacy, assessment of safety, statistics, direct access to source data and documents, quality control and quality assurance, ethics bit, which is generally described as description of ethical considerations in relation to the trial, data handling and record keeping, finance and insurance, publication policy, and other supplementary data. And other documents that might be required to be attached would be like the CV of the principal investigator, investigator's brochure, UDRA CT form if you are submitting it to Europe, or clinicaltrials.gov counterpart, questionnaires if there are any, interview guides if there are any, age appropriate info sheet for children if the study involves children, consent form for parents, again when the research is on minors, and consent form for persons able to consent, and other documents that the research ethics committee might find necessary. Now, and this is something that I have adapted from the Forum for Ethical Review Committees in Asia and the Western Pacific region. So generally, there are three types of review. There is exempted. There are researches that are exempted from review. There's expedited review process for some types of research, and there's also the full board review. And so, what do we mean by exempt? It means that well, there are different laws depending on which country you're in, right? But if for example your research does not involve research participants or does not involve the gathering of human data, so it may be that your research may be exempt from review. In which case, the only thing that needs to be done is, again, depending on the country, will be some kind of an acknowledgement that this study is exempted from research ethics review. But there's also what we call expedited review, right? And expedited review means that the risk is minimal. And it may also mean that limited number of reviewers will be looking into the protocol, the application form, etc., etc., etc. Right? Now, when we say full board, this refers to everyone, or at least a quorum has to be reached to do a full board review. Yeah. So full board review ideally would mean that the study has more than minimal, is a little bit beyond minimal risk. Right, so you will have the full board as mentioned in both expedited and full board. And ideally, the research ethics committee comes up with some sort of a certificate of approval or some kind of letter of decision. Okay. Just some notes on expedited review before we talk about the review process. So expedited review, as mentioned a while ago, is applicable to non-significant risk or minimal risk protocols, protocols that are non-confidential. That means not likely to harm or to offend, or are not likely to expose things that ought to be considered private. Yeah, involve non-invasive or routine procedures, protocols that use previously collected data or specimens, or shall we say data that may be publicly might be publicly accessible. Minor revision of previously approved protocol, and procedural items such as, for example, names of personnel, a change of phone number, or change of address, things such as that. Now, our research ethics committee should be able to specify the nature of the applications, amendments, and other considerations that will be eligible for expedited review. This means that in the process of establishing an ethics committee, what are the procedures, for expedited review, and which kinds of research could be reviewed expeditiously ought to be established. And the quorum requirements for expedited review, would there be one or two reviewers, or do you need more than that? And the status of decisions. In terms of decision making, does the ethics committee allow these one or two persons to do the decision for them? Or do you just make these one or two persons do some kind of review, but the actual decision has to be done by the full ethics committee? So these are procedures that must be established before an ethics committee starts doing its job. So in the establishment of an ethics committee, these are things that need to be done. Now let's go into the actual review process. Yeah. So the primary task of an ethics committee lies in the review of research proposals and their supporting documents, with special attention given to the informed consent process, documentation, and the suitability and feasibility of the protocol. Ethics committees need to take into account prior scientific reviews, if any, and the requirements of applicable laws and regulations. Yeah. This is according to the WHO operational guidelines for ethics committees that review biomedical research. This is also the BOK reference that we will be using throughout this lecture. So points for review, according to the WHO, according to this document, there are at least 6 points for review. We will look at each point and see what it means in terms of the actualization of the task of research ethics committees, right? But let's just go through them very quickly. So the 6 points are the following: scientific design and conduct of the study, recruitment of research participants, care and protection of research participants, protection of research participant confidentiality, informed consent process, and community considerations. Let's go through each point then. So the point of scientific design and conduct of the study. So remember that these are points that ethics committees need to evaluate, not only put a check mark on. Right. So one common misunderstanding when it comes to task of research ethics committees is that the task is simply going through a checklist. That is as far as the truth as I know it. Yeah? Because an ethics committee ought to be evaluating. Right. So these points are there just to tell you what you should evaluate. It doesn't tell you, but it doesn't say that it's something that you should simply check. Right. So when we say evaluation, it means that ethics committees talk about them, right? Discuss among themselves whether this requirement has been achieved or not. Right. And if it has not been achieved, is it so bad that you would reject the study, or is it something that can be amended? Okay, now with that in mind, let's go through what we mean by the points referring to scientific design and conduct of the study. The first is that ethics committee would want to look into the appropriateness of the study design, including statistical methodology, for example, sample size calculation. But also you want to look into, for example, the number of participants. Right. So when we talk about so you see immediately that this has something to do with the scientific validity of the study. Right. So if a study uses the wrong statistical method, then you're just wasting everyone's time and also wasting resources. But also within this would be looking into the number of research participants. You know, so considering your statistical methodology, is the number of participants stated in the protocol justifiable? Right. So if you can achieve the desired results with 10, why are you including 20? Just as an example. Next will be the justification of predictable risks and inconveniences weighed against the anticipated benefits for the research participants and the concerned communities. So in an earlier lecture, we talked about the task of balancing risk and benefits. Right. So remember that all research, or most research, especially if it includes research participants, either research participants in person are included or their data, all these kinds of research would have some type of risk. Yeah, and such risks are justified because we foresee some kind of benefit. Now, it is the task of research ethics committees to weigh these risks against these foreseen benefits. Right? Again, rule of thumb: a research study is ethically justified only when the risks do not outweigh benefits. Ideally, you would want benefits to outweigh risks. Okay. Next will be the justification of the use of control arms. What we have, if you have a multi-arm trial, what are these arms? Of course, you would have the study arm. You would have the experimental arm, but you would have another one. Is it placebo? Is it the use of a standard drug? And then of course you would want the ethics committee to look into whether this is justifiable or not. Next will be criteria for prematurely withdrawing research participants. So it is possible that the principal investigator would withdraw some research participants. What will be the criteria for such a withdrawal? We're not yet talking about research participants voluntarily withdrawing themselves. We're talking about principal investigators withdrawing research participants. Yeah? So an ethics committee would want to look into what will be the procedure for this, and when is this allowed, or when is this required. You want to know, the ethics committee would want to see whether this is something that is really justifiable, or there's some sort of randomness in it. Criteria for suspending or terminating the research as a whole. Next would be the adequacy of provisions made for monitoring and auditing the conduct of the research, including the constitution of the Data Safety Monitoring Board. Right. So an ethics committee would want to look into how the study will be monitored, how frequent, by whom, and what are the procedures when the Data and Safety Monitoring Board finds something. Right. So in previous research, we saw that there might be a Data and Safety Monitoring Board, but then a problem may occur once a Data and Safety Monitoring Board finds something worth reporting. Right. So if a Data and Safety Monitoring Board finds something and reports to the principal investigator, what then happens? What if it's an adverse event? What if it's a severe adverse event? Right. There has to be clear protocols on what should be done. The adequacy of the site, including the supporting staff, available facilities, and emergency procedures. Again, previous studies have shown that some research are not are without adequate facilities. So for example, there were some research participants did not have their own patient research participants did not have their own beds. That they had to share a bed or wait for a bed, while being part of a study. Right? I mean, things such as this one, but also it has to do with supporting staff. Are they qualified? Are there enough staff to do this research? And of course, emergency procedures. Again, if there are adverse events, if there are severe adverse events, what should happen? Who should be informed first? What should be done to the research participant, etc., etc. The manner in which the results of the research will be reported and published. So ideally, we want the results to be published, even if the result is negative. Yeah. And how the results will be reported and published, ideally, is something also that the Research Ethics Committee would want to look into. Next will be recruitment of research participants. This refers, so ethics committees want to look into the characteristics of the population from which the research participant will be drawn, including gender, age, literacy, culture, economic status, and ethnicity. Again, we've mentioned this already a while ago. So who will be recruited from which population and why, right? So you want to have very clear scientific reasons for doing so, but also very clear justice reasons for doing so, right? The means by which initial contact and recruitment is to be conducted. So how will you invite research participants? Are you going to ask them one by one, or are you going to ask, the head of the community, for example? Are you going to have an advertisement? Right. So depending on what kind of research is being done, there are possible risks on that recruitment process may pose. For example, if a research is about a disease that attached to it is some sort of taboo, right? So a research such as that cannot be just casually announced, where participants have the risk of being known as potential participants, precisely because it is about the disease that has attached to it is some form of a taboo, right? So this recruitment process, if not properly safeguarded, can pose as a form of social risk, economic risk, or even physical risk to the research participants. Yeah. And that's why research ethics committees need to make sure that they also look into this. The means by which full information is to be conveyed to potential research participants or their representatives. When we say full information, we're talking about information that is sufficient for any reasonable person to make a good judgment, right, on whether or not they want to be part of a trial. We're not talking about information about the most recent publication on this topic, right? That's with an elaboration of what this recent study is all about, with all these technical scientific terms, that the average person wouldn't have access to, or would probably not understand. And only a specialist will have a proper appreciation of. We're not talking about that. We're talking about information that is necessary for the average person to make a rational decision on whether or not they want to be part of a study. Earlier, when we looked into informed consent, we saw what, for example, the Declaration of Helsinki requires in terms of content, And this is where this is most relevant to. Inclusion criteria for research participants, exclusion criteria for research participants. This has to do, again, with scientific, but also justice reasons. Next will be care and protection of research participants. So an ethics committee would want to look into the suitability of the investigator's qualifications and experience for the proposed study. Right? Why is that? Because we don't want somebody who doesn't know what he's doing to be wasting time and resources of their time and their resources, but also of their research participants' time and resources. Right? So you want to make sure that the persons involved actually know, are qualified, and have sufficient experience to do a particular type of research. Of course, we can always think, how about students doing research? Yes, of course, that is a legitimate activity, but bear in mind that that always comes in with some form of a supervision, right? Next will be any plans to withdraw or withhold standard therapies for the purpose of the research and the justification for such an action. So it may be that research will require research participants to not take the standard therapy, especially if you're doing an experiment on a drug, on a specific disease, and you want to see if this drug, you want to test, for example, how safe this drug is, and therefore you don't want at least the research participants in the study arm to also take the standard therapy if such exists, right? So a research ethics committee would want to look into these plans for withdrawal or withholding standard therapies if they're justified, if they will not pose additional risk to the research participants. The committee would also want to look into the medical care to be provided to research participants during and after the course of the research. We already said this a while ago. The researchers are responsible for adverse events and severe adverse events that happen to research participants while in research, but also maybe there might be some kind of unnecessary medical care post-research, right? So if, for example, you're doing an experiment on a drug, on a disease, without yet some kind of available intervention on it, and after a phase 3 study, you see that the study drug has a level of efficacy and safety for this group of research participants, for these patient participants. There might therefore be some kind of responsibility on the side of the sponsor to continuously provide this study drug to this set of research participants, because there is this whole ethical issue of whether a sponsor is simply allowed to leave research participants who benefited from a study, who otherwise would not have any kind of therapy, after a study. Right. So again, that's something that an ethics committee would want to look into. So it will be unethical to leave research participants who obviously benefited from a study drug without any kind of access after the study. So some kind of assurance has to be present that there will be that they will be medically attended to. And what this means, of course, will have to be stipulated in the protocol, and that the research ethics committee would have to look into. The committee will also have to look into the adequacy of medical supervision and psychosocial support for the research participants, whichever is relevant. They have to look into the steps to be taken if research participants voluntarily withdraw during the course of the research. it might be that research participants will still, it might be that that the data prior to their withdrawal will still be considered part of the research. Then what then happens to the research participants, especially those that still need continuous medical attention, when they voluntarily withdraw from the study? So again, things for the committee to think about or to look into. The committee will also have to look into the criteria for extended access to the emergency use of or the compassionate use of study products, right? So we've said this already a while ago. Post-study, what kind of access will, if any, will the research participants have? What kind of access will the community have? What kind of access will, I don't know, this group of patients have, if any? Right. So at least the Research Ethics Committee should have clarity on this and should be convinced, of what kind of access will be provided, if any, or if none at all. Why is that justifiable? Next, the Ethics Committee would want to look into the arrangements and, if appropriate, for informing the research participants' general practitioner, including procedures for seeking the participants' consent to do so. What are the arrangements? If it's at all necessary to involve or to inform the GP of the patient participant of a study. So this is not always appropriate to do or necessary to do. But when it is, then what are the arrangements? What are the arrangements to do that? And what are also the arrangements to make sure that before that is being done, that there's the actual consent of the research participant, of the patient participant, to do so. Next, a description of any plans to make the study product available to the research participants following the research. We have mentioned this already a while ago. If especially in cases when it is necessary, but also when it is not, when it's not as necessary. But for example, if they have still some form of access to standard therapy, but if your research shows that they actually have more benefits with this study drug, will you provide it to this research participants, or to this community, or to this country? And again, that needs some form of justification, which the Ethics Committee would have to evaluate. Next, a description of any financial costs to research participants, if any. Ideally, there should be none, right? Because you don't want them to have financial risks simply because they're part of a study. You actually want them to benefit, right? So this could happen, of course. I was in one conference one time, and it was casually mentioned by one of the speakers that, well, yes, we do clinical trials in our country, and part of it means requiring research participants to pay this amount of money because there's a long list of research participants, and that was just plainly unacceptable. It's plainly unethical, right? Next, Ethics Committee would want to look into the rewards and compensations for research participants. Do they get paid? Do they receive some kind of service? Do they receive some kind of gifts? Why do they want to look into this? Why would an Ethics Committee want to look into this? Because we want to see if there's what we call undue inducement. Remember this? This refers to giving excessively too much to a research participant for them to for their participation in research, such that it's almost virtually impossible for them to make a rational decision, especially for a vulnerable population. Imagine paying so much money to an individual who is economically vulnerable, in a study that is highly toxic, at least some high risk of the toxicity. A person who is desperate for funds might forego these considerations of toxicity because precisely because they need the money. Right? So an ethics committee would want to make sure that there's no what we call undue inducement. So it doesn't mean that there's no payment, but that the payment should not be undue, such that it stops persons from thinking properly, or that the gifts are not undue, or the services are not undue, that stops making people make good decisions. Next will be the provisions for compensation or treatment in the case of injury, disability, or death of a research participant attributable to participation in the research. Are there compensations or what are there provisions for compensation and or treatment in case of injury, disability, or death? And if there are these sufficient? Yeah. Next will be is there insurance and indemnity arrangements? Next point, protection of research participants' confidentiality. So a description of the persons who will have access to personal data of the research participants, including medical records and biological samples. This is something that an ethics committee would have to look into. Who will have access to the personal data? What kind of access? Will they have access to everything? Up to when will they have access to? But also in connection with that would be measures taken to ensure the confidentiality and security of personal information concerning research participants. Where will the data be kept, and what safeguards are in place? For example, in Europe, there are GDPR requirements on keeping research data, right? So do you keep it lock and key in a physical setting? Are you keeping it in your computer with a certain safety protocol, or are you keeping it in an institutionally required cloud, again with a tight safety protocol? So all of these things are matters for an ethics committee would have to look into. And if data is to be kept in these facilities, how long will they be kept? In what form will they be kept? Okay. Next will be the informed consent process. So an ethics committee needs to look into the process for obtaining informed consent. We have seen this a while ago, including identification of those responsible for obtaining consent, the adequacy, completeness, and understandability of written and oral information given to research participants and or legally acceptable representatives. Again, we saw this a while ago. That it's not only that you give information, but you want to make sure that the information is truly understood, and that the information is sufficiently complete for a person to make a decision. Right? Ideally, this is something that this information is given in written and in oral form. Right? Clear justification for the intention to include in the research individuals who cannot consent, and a full account of the arrangements for obtaining consent or authorization for the participation of such individuals. We saw this earlier. Potential research participants who are unable to consent must be included in a trial only when it's justifiable to do so. That is, only when such a trial cannot be done on individuals who are able to consent. Think, for example, of children. Why would you do a clinical trial on children? Because you want to have pediatric data, not because it's quite easy to have children as research participants. Right, so there has to be the justification for their inclusion in a research study, and not only a justification of their inclusion, but also a justification of the informed consent process. Right, so in the case of children, for example, who are able to already appreciate or understand research processes, you would want to have the consent of the legal representative most of the time, for example, parents, but you'd also want to have the assent of children who are already able to understand. right? So this means an oral explanation to both, and ideally also written explanation, written consent process for both the parents and or guardian, and the child who is already able to understand and comprehend. Assurances that research participants will receive information that becomes available during the course of the research relevant to their participation. For example, if you're changing the protocol and you have asked for consent on another protocol and not the new one, you need to make sure that this is something that you inform, or not even inform, you ask maybe it's even required that there's a reconsent process, right? And then ethics committee would want to make sure that such is in place, that research participants will be told when new information that is relevant to them, to their health, but also in their relevant to their participation in study, when such information becomes available, that research participants will be told, right? And research ethics committees need to make sure that that's present. Next, a research ethics committee will look into the provisions made for receiving and responding to queries and complaints. So again, the ethics committee simply needs to make sure that there are provisions and procedures in place, and that these are quite easy provisions and procedures if there are queries and complaints, about the research or specific researchers, about the process or anything that has to do with research, right? So you want to make sure that there is a responsible person, and that the phone number and the contact information of this responsible person is provided in the informed consent, but also that the research participants are informed that they can also get in touch, for example, to the research, that they can get in touch with the research to the research ethics committee and file a complaint, if there are any. Next, an ethics committee would also have to look into community considerations. And by that we mean an ethics committee would have to look into the impact and relevance of the research on the local community. So it says impact and relevance, right? So by relevance, it means, is it addressing a community need? Right. So you want, before an ethics committee allows a research on a specific community, the research ethics committee would have to first ask the question: is this research relevant to this community, such that it addresses a real need of this community? But also it talks about impact, and by impact again we refer to what happens to the community after. If they form part of this trial, and after it, what do they get from it? Recall our discussion a while ago on post-trial benefits. Ethics committee would also want to look into the steps taken to consult with the concerned communities during the course of designing the research. Because again, we've earlier said that we want to have community collaboration, we want to have community involvement. Was the community consulted, in the process of designing research? How will the community be involved? And so because we want the community to be involved beyond simply being the sources of data. We want the community to be involved in planning at least certain parts of the research. For example, planning informed consent procedures. Next, an ethics committee would want to look into the influence of the community on the consent of individuals. So recall that informed consent is something very personal. It might be that the head of the community will have to be consulted prior to going to research participants and asking them to be part of the study and asking for the informed consent. But remember that the actual informed consent must be provided only and solely by the research participant, not the husband, not the spouse, not the child, not the head of the community, but the research participant himself or herself. If something influences the voluntariness of the informed consent procedure, thereby making the informed consent procedure invalid, right? This is something that the Research Ethics Committee would have to also flag, right, and address. Next will be proposed community consultation during the course of the research. So you consult the community not only before research, but ideally also while you're doing research. The protocol should clarify when and why. Next, Ethics Committee will look into the extent to which the research contributes to capacity building. And by capacity building, we refer to, for example, enhancement of local healthcare, provision of research infrastructure, and the ability to respond to public health needs. So are we giving training, for example? Are we giving training locally such that this research capacity such that this increases the research capacity of the host community? Are we providing some kind of public healthcare need? Are we providing, for example, if there's a lacuna in terms of public health measures, again because of lack of funds, this research in one way or another increases the capacity of such a community to respond to such a lacuna. Next, a description of the availability and affordability of any successful study product to the concerned communities following the research, still referring to post-trial access. Will the product be available to the participants of the community or the country once the product has been licensed for marketing authorization? Next, the manner in which the results of the research will be made available to the research participants and the concerned communities. Again, will you inform them? Who will you inform? Who will the researchers inform in terms of results? Is it the community? Is it the chieftain? Or is it the world through, for example, a publication, or all of them? Yeah, so it means that they're preparing a publication, maybe also a white paper, to make sure that the community understands what the results were. Next, we look into the decision-making process of research ethics committees. And these are just basic points, number one, in the process of coming up with a decision, ethics committees would want to remove any kind of conflicts of interest. Right, so if a person is in one way or another involved in research, that person should not take part in the decision-making process. An ethics committee should be given sufficient time to review an application before a decision. You want to have the agreed quorum in decision-making. The documents required for a full review of the application should be complete. Right, and the relevant elements mentioned above should be considered. Elements, the points to consider we saw a while ago. Only members who participate in the review should participate in the decision, of course, because you want an informed decision. You want a rational decision. There should also be a method of arriving at the decision. This is either by consensus or by voting. Ideally, you want a consensus, but for example, if a consensus cannot be achieved, most of the time, research ethics committees resort to voting. Ethics committees in the decision-making process might also provide advice that is non-binding, and also they might come up with some what we call conditional decisions. That is, we will approve this if, right? This means the ethics committee should provide clear suggestions for revision and the procedure for having the application re-reviewed. So these should be clearly specified. And in the event of a negative decision, such a negative decision should be supported by clearly stated reasons. So the decision making has the possible results of approval, minor modification, major modifications, or request for information that so decision cannot be made, or disapproved. At the same time, with this would be the provision of procedures for continuing review. So by continuing review, this could mean that every year or every several times, an ethics committee would re-review a study. No, but this has to be clearly established why, when, and what needs to be reported to the Research Ethics Committee for the Ethics Committee to do the review. So a continuing review may happen if there are any protocol amendments that are likely to affect the rights, safety, and well-being of the research participants or the conduct of the study, if there are serious and unexpected adverse events, and if new information that may affect the benefit-risk ratio of the study comes up. All right, this would be just very quick. Research Ethics Committee should, of course, keep the records and keep them safe. An example of records to be kept will be SOPs, standard operating procedures, membership files, submitted documents, minutes, and correspondences. So such records should be made available to regulatory authorities and make available its standard, and the Ethics Committee should make its standard operating procedures available to investigators, sponsors, and regulatory authorities, of course, because Research Ethics Committee procedures should not be kept in a black box. Last thing we want to say would be just as a note of what the research ethics challenges are that we encounter. First is the need to address the growing public mistrust of research. And of course, an ethics committee would be an important element in that. Next will be the need to develop capacity for quality review. As we said a while ago, we want to make sure that ethics committee members have enough qualification and capacity to do the review. Also, the need to harmonize research ethics requirements in different parts of the world. Because we want to make sure that an ethics approval is a real one, whether you are in this part of the world or in another place. The need to develop ethical review systems that involve research stakeholders, such as regulatory authorities, industry, academic, patient groups. And by this, we do not mean that we want industry members to be research ethics committee members, right? But we're talking about an ethical review system, right? So it means that that sufficient information was provided, for example, by the industry. For the ethics committee review to be valid or to be sufficient. But you also would want a close connection between an ethics committee and the regulatory authorities, because, for example, health inspectors come to inspect ethics committees, right? Or that an ethics committee review is submitted to specific regulators. So this is what we call by an ethical review system.
Thank you very much for listening. I hope this video will be useful for you.